Hello. Let's see here.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Nice to have you. Yeah. Let's see here. Hello, Leah. Nice to have you as well. Extra credit points for both of you. All right. So, how are you doing on the in the class in general? How are you guys feeling on this Cold War assignment?
Personally, I think it's a little bit harder from
Yeah.
before, but I think we can work something out.
Okay. Good. 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 No,
Yeah.
thank you for your honesty. All right. Well, let's go ahead and dive right into it then. Okay. So Okay, good. No, I appreciate your honesty, Leah. Um, so in the first one, right, I set the stage. So I would say, right, I try to just give a generic definition of the Cold War right at the beginning. And by the way, I would highly recommend if you wanted to look more into the just get a firm factual foundation, CNN's documentary on the Cold War. It has multiple episodes, but they're entitled, and so each title will give you a great idea as to what you will be learning in that episode. But at any rate, very respectable, factually rich documentary. And so to me, the Cold War, right, was a time period of geopolitical and military tension and competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Remember, geopolitics, right? Is you put the interest in the survival and the protection of your nation first, and you look at the world as if it were a chessboard, and you deal with contingencies, you deal with the what ifs, right? In particular, right, very cynically, any types of future threats that you might be able to, prognosticate, try to predict. And so when you look at different areas, you try to preemptively prepare yourselves for those contingencies, right, and protect yourself from them. So a typical example, or a couple typical examples of geopolitics would be alliances, right? Trying to make uh, established alliances with key pivotal countries, nations, right? That you think will be of great help, of great assistance to you should you go to war with that other country, right? Another one would be uh, the maintenance of key areas that you believe are vital militarily, right? Militarily and or economically. And so let's say, oil. I mean, you saw the importance of oil, right, with the Japanese and dictating their military conquests in the Pacific and in Asia, East Asia. And so make sure that you have, the resources for your war machine, right? Um, that'd be another example. Also, key ports, right? Like we talked about, like going back to the Spanish American War. I kind of jokingly said like coaling stations in the Pacific Ocean were kind of like AMPMs, these pit stops to get coal to burn in your engines to keep it going across the Pacific. So key vital areas, right, and key vital resources that you think you'll need, not only just for the maintenance of your economy and well-being and to be self-sufficient as a country economically, but to have vital resources militarily in the event of going to war, right? Another one, of course, is any kind of a bit of an arms race where you are trying to beef up your military prospects, your military power and resources, right? And not only just with the obvious, with war manufacturing of fighter jets, tanks, etc., but also a lot of research and development, right, to deal with where you think the future's going as far as state of the art weaponry. And yes, that includes biological and atomic weaponry, right? And the places that we had in trying to stay up to date and employing the greatest minds to stay up to date in that regard. All right. And so going on to this topic, we're going to fight in the Cold War. We're going to fight most famously in Korea, right, from 50 to 53. And we're going to fight in the mid to late 60s through 74 in Vietnam. And we're going to fight what we believe to be, right, the Soviet menace by proxy. We're not going to actually fight Soviet soldiers, but the Soviets are going to help arm our enemy and support their that country, whether it be North Korea or Northern Vietnam, their desire to aggrandize, to add territory to communist regimes across the world. Okay, and very famously, we're going to declare the Truman Doctrine, right? And you should see there on the handout, I give just my brief subjective take on that, just kind of a brief definition that anywhere in the world, President Truman is going to state, right, where a freedom loving, peaceful majority of people are threatened by the armed imposition, right? So, against their will, by the armed imposition of communism to be placed upon them by combat, by war, by the threat of violence, we're going to come in and protect that peaceful majority. So, it's through the Cold War context, and in particular, the Truman Doctrine, that we're going to help protect the South Koreans from a North Korean invasion, and we're going to help allegedly protect the South Vietnamese from a Northern Vietnamese invasion, in the name of keeping communism intact where it is, boundary wise, and keep it from aggrandizing by force, right? And so, kind of becoming the world's policeman, if you will, through the Truman Doctrine. So, at any rate, going to number one is just I'm trying to give evidence and make the argument, right, setting the stage for the Cold War, that the United States capitalist system and the Soviet Union's communist system are economically or ideologically incompatible. That we were not likely to become comfortable allies from the get-go, just from the economic systems that we happen to have, right? In particular, with communism, when they look at the works of Karl Marx and Joseph Engels, they depicted capitalism, right, in a very parasitical manner, that for some to win, others have to lose. They believe that the system is kind of rigged for the rich, for those who are rich to begin with. And so to them, capitalism is unethical, it's unfair, it's immoral. To them, it leads to a plutocracy, the rule by the wealthy over everybody else. Okay, and so to them, capitalism will and ought to morally and historically come to an end when inevitably the concentration of wealth is going to become so inequitable, so imbalanced and unfair, that the mass majority of especially displaced entrepreneurs, the small guys who are beaten out by the Rockefellers of the world, and in particular, the members of the proletariat, the industrial laboring class, that they're going to have enough and they're going to organize and they're going to develop a sense of class consciousness, so that they don't think of themselves firstly through their religion as far as their own self-identity, not through their nationality or ethnicity, but they identify first and foremost by their class, by their socioeconomic class. And they're going to eventually unite as they ought to. And this is a heroic, laden with justice movement that they were predicting. And they would overthrow this plutocracy, this oligarchy at the top, right? And that eventually their goal was kind of like a John Lennon song, if you will, right? an anarchic form of communism in which, kind of like a hippie commune, if you will, where there would no longer eventually be a need for a state, and that people would share and cooperate, and all would be allocated resources according to need rather than by American political tradition, by merit. And but until then, right, Marx and Engels had written about, and of course, Lenin and others of the Bolshevik Revolution believed that it was necessary for a period of time, that there needed to be a few transitions before they got to that kind of panacea, that utopian happy ending. And amidst that time, that there needed to be a dictatorship, in the name of the proletariat, of the people, but by an elite cadre of people who were well versed in Marxist writings and knew how to set the system up of even allocation according to need, and so forth, so that the state would control the allocation of resources, right? And so to Americans, they look at that phase because it seems like no one in a communist regime has been able to evolve past that stage. It seems, arguably, historically, right? We haven't seen a stateless society evenly allocating property, sharing everything. We've yet to see that, larger than different types of small communes that were attempted by a guy named like Charles Fourier in his writings. We tried communes in New England before the Civil War, etc., but not like a big nation, much less a big empire. And neither have we really seen a lot of syndicalism. Syndicalism is a democratic, decentralized form of communism, whereby the people in each region, they democratically, they rule the roost in their own region. They democratically, the workers themselves, the manual laborers, they decide and run the even allocation of resources and property, etc. So instead, right, we see the ugly side of communism, and that is statism, where the state is dictating terms, the state owns everything. Um, and oftentimes, right, in human history, human beings, and the particular human beings that have become infamous in history, like Joseph Stalin, they tended to really throw their weight around. I think that's almost an understatement, as far as their people like Stalin with their somewhat tyrannical type manner in which they ruled. And so to Americans, right, communism is equated to lack of freedom. That's kind of our litmus test, right? It comes from the Scottish Enlightenment during the War for Independence, and we read about that, and I wrote about that, and we've discussed that. Oftentimes the foundation for our Bill of Rights, arguably, along with the French Enlightenment, constitutionalism, checks and balances, the people having a right to arm themselves and to always be wary of Big Brother, of the big government, right? So that kind of Scottish libertarian fear of big government has been a big part of American political tradition. Even when we haven't practiced it, it's part of our cultural tradition and our rhetoric in this country. So when we see communism, right, we see lack of freedom. We see these elites and the state controlling everything, right? Um, to the communist regimes, like in the Soviet Union, instead of using liberty as their litmus test, they use equity as their litmus test. What is fair? What is equal? In terms of allowing people to have equality of condition, of being roughly in the same economic, comfortable, self-sustaining situation. And so to them, right, they look at American capitalism, and we see the good side of it and saying, okay, when we think of American capitalism, we think of an immigrant family coming from Korea or somewhere and starting up a mom and pop shop in New Jersey, and being able to afford to get enough savings from their store, their business, to send their kids to college, etc. Right? We look at that as an example of opportunities for everyone, equality of opportunity, and people working hard to achieve the American dream and having the liberty to do what they want for a living, etc. Right? Whereas the communists, they might see an example like of the Standard Fruit or United Fruit Company in Nicaragua, where they own like between 80 and 90% of the arable land in that country. And they're this giant octopus that has all this monopoly over all the good land, and they're paying people almost nothing to work. They're almost the sole employer in many regions of that Central American country. And what about the rest of the Nicaraguan people as far as access to land, competing with the big fruit companies? Good luck, right? So to them, they see it as a topic of equity rather than freedom. And so on number one, I'm trying to set the stage that ideologically, the United States and its capitalist system and the Soviet Union and its communist system are incompatible. They're at odds, right, with each other. So look for that on number one, okay? And then I go to the old argument, right, of I don't want to say too much on this because we're going to get back to this, okay, in the second Cold War assignment. But the notion of deterrence, okay, deterrence is like letting neighbors know that you have a big dog and that the owners of the house own a gun, right? It's founded on distrust. It's founded on a cynical view of human nature, that there is, at least is a demographic of people in any given society that will take advantage of perceived weakness, and that the best way to deter or to stop them ahead of time, to prevent them from engaging in some type of bully-like behavior, is to literally make them afraid of the possible consequences of their actions, to literally frighten them into behaving. And so we've had a few presidents that have come down in history, right? Harry Truman, Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, who really advocated that theory that the Soviet Union is a proverbial bully, and its leaders, particularly under Stalin, only understand one language, and that is force, and that is a fear of consequences. And so on the one hand, right, some people have kind of lionized, they praised this policy and the tough presidents we've had, like Truman, and saying that they were just the men for the job. At the end of the next section, I put a new sheriff was in town, right? And that is through the person of President Harry Truman. So I depict him as a man who had fought against bullying his whole life, as a man who saw things in a very, I don't know, just kind of an old school dichotomy of good and evil, etc. And who, like Winston Churchill had done, not only with Hitler, but then Winston Churchill will also do with Joseph Stalin, who knows a bully when he sees one, and knows that you have to stand up to that bully and make him afraid of messing with you, basically, right? So on that next section, I'm praising Harry Truman and saying that his confrontational stance, his tough stance in this Cold War tension and competition with the Soviet Union was healthy for our safety. It kept Stalin at bay and kept him from exercising his natural tendency to be the bully. So you look for evidence of that, right? I try to find evidence to try to convey that message. So for one, I try to set the stage of Stalin being a bully, right? And so remember that people in the Soviet Union itself, other political leaders especially, saw a threat in Stalin. There was a common accusation that this man was not an ideologue like supposedly Vladimir Lenin was, Lenin supposedly was more of an intellectual. He was more in tune with the writings of Karl Marx and Engels and wanted to implement what they had written down, right? And had this grand romantic vision for the Soviet Union. And if he did anything in a heavy handed manner, it was seen as a pragmatic, temporary necessity in getting Russia on its way to that happy solution, right? With Stalin, there was more concern that he was more concerned with himself, with holding power, um, with leading as kind of through the cult of personality, and made things more about himself and his own power. Not to mention that he may have literally have been almost clinically paranoid as a man and as a leader. You got to recall this guy very likely, according to the sources, killed his own wife and had his son killed after that. Um, this guy killed the cream of his crop in his own military through his purges. You can look up Stalin's purges, and it's incredible how many people, not only how many people he had killed or sent to the gulags, his military prisons, right? His kind of concentration camps and labor camps. Not only that, but just the atmosphere itself, right? Uh, Absolutely nothing akin to due process. The people, it was like you were considered guilty until you could prove yourself innocent, rather than the contrary. This atmosphere of complete fear. Like I said, you look at the CNN documentary, and it's not necessarily, although at times it is, it does kind of advocate court history. So you got to keep that in mind, where it kind of vilifies the Soviet Union, but it also gives dirt on the US. So there's some revisionist history in this documentary as well, but it definitely gives dirt on Stalin if you wanted to look further into it. And so I try to depict him as the proverbial bully over his own people, and then also internationally. And so, for instance, right, when um, Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi German invasion of Russia, when it began to unwind and go sourly for the Germans, remember they took over about 3/4 of Russia rather quickly, and but everything went downhill after that. The particular winter, the million-man Manchurian army that the Soviets were saving up to use, the decision by the Nazi German command to split their invasion army uh, into North and South and split it up to go south for the Caucasus, for the oil there in the Ukraine, and then their stubbornness and trying to fight a symbolic rather than geopolitically important city like Stalingrad. All of that is going to backfire. And so when the Russians start chasing the Germans back across the border, right, um, they began um, they began keeping their infamous T-34 Russian tanks and soldiers over these quote liberated countries, and ensuring that those countries were friendly, quote friendly, to the Soviet Union and to communism. So you look at countries like Romania and Bulgaria, right down toward the Balkans and Albania. You look at Poland, especially Poland, right between um, Germany and Russia, Hungary, etc., the Czech Republic. When they came into these areas, they pretty much put puppet governments over them. And remember, according to the Atlantic Charter, uh, going back to Woodrow Wilson and before, is we claim we were fighting for the self-determination and the individual rights of people in all nations throughout the world against these fascist countries and their invasion armies. And so here we were claiming that, yet Stalin was not allowing self-determination for these people and what would later be called these satellite states, these countries that he would incorporate into a military contingency and economic union known as the Warsaw Pact. So as he's taken over these countries, right, we're meeting We met at Yalta in Russia. The leaders met later at Potsdam, etc. And it was very awkward for Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill meeting with Stalin. They're like, okay, Stalin, what about having free and fair elections in Yugoslavia, in the Czech Republic, in Poland? And Stalin supposedly at Yalta eventually verbally promised he would allow free and fair elections in due time in these countries, right? And there's good evidence to more than suggest that that never came through. He broke his promise, and FDR wouldn't really confront him on this. FDR, it goes back to FDR's personality, like you see in the video there and the CNN documentary. They contend that when he went to Yalta, FDR was warned, be careful what you say on the phone and inside your room as you stay here in this hotel. Stalin likely has it bugged. And supposedly FDR smiled and winked at the gentleman and said, that's okay, I have him bugged as well. Franklin Roosevelt was very kind of sly. His way was not the way of confrontation. And so for the while, right, we were kind of strange bedfellows. We were allies because merely we were fighting the same enemy, the Nazi Germany in Europe. And there was a lot of incompatibility in our systems, a lot of distrust. Not to mention, right, we had the Bletchley Park in England. Our men were invited there, and to crack the codes of Nazi Germany through the Enigma machine, etc., and Operation Magic and Ultra, and the Japanese code as well. And we scarcely shared that with Russia, and Russia really could have used that information. And I remember going back to the Bolshevik Revolution, Woodrow Wilson sent thousands of soldiers to Russia during their civil war. And so they had reason to distrust us as well, as we weren't very reliable allies, and they knew that we were against communism. They saw our Red Scare at the end of World War I and how we treated the socialist and communist parties in our country. And so there was a lot of distrust on both sides, even as we were allegedly, allies during World War II. But again, right, this notion that Stalin was playing the bully. At the end of the war, we at the southwestern border of the Russian Soviet Union Empire, it is contiguous with Iran, and he refused to get his troops out of Iran, and we were very angry about that. When he came in at the last minute and tried to help us with the Japanese, Truman's going to say no, thank you, because when he brought troops into North Korea, they didn't leave, and they helped impose a communist regime in North Korea. So we didn't want his help because he was imposing his own communist puppet governments and regimes in these countries where his army was supposed to be liberating the people, not enslaving them. So at any rate, in comes Truman. And one of the first things Truman does, right, at Potsdam was very different from Yalta. Kind of phony smiles, handshakes. Franklin Roosevelt knew he couldn't trust Stalin, but yet he would not confront him. He had a more roundabout, sly manner of dealing with him. And now in comes Truman, right? Because FDR died in the midst of his fourth term. And Truman comes in and he immediately scolds Molotov, the ambassador of Russia, and says, your leader promised free and fair elections in Poland and these other countries, and he has not made good on that promise, and kind of threateningly. And then he also boasted about our new toy, if you will, our atomic weapons, our hydrogen and plutonium bombs that we're trying out in New Mexico under the Manhattan Project. And he kind of boasts and with a bit of a veiled threat to Stalin, right? And Truman even bragged later and said that he was trying to keep Stalin manageable at the diplomatic table by reminding him of our, at that time, apparent monopoly on the atomic bomb. And so at any rate, you see Berlin, right? Truman thought that Berlin was too important of a city It was too far west in from central in toward Western Europe to just give up to the Soviets. So they put it in different sectors, Germany itself, but Berlin was in the Russian sector. And they said, and he insisted, no, we are going to share Berlin, even though it's in your Russian sector of Germany, of German occupied land. And so that created tension, but it arguably was putting Stalin in his place, right? And then you have, I write about, and you can read about the Berlin airlift, right? Whereby we amalgamated our territory in Germany and in Berlin with the French and the British, formed our own currency, and were winning the municipal, city council, and mayor positions of Berlin. People who were pro-West, pro-capitalism and Republican government, and anti-communist and anti-Russian. Well, this was too much for Stalin because Berlin was in the heart of the Russian-held eastern sector of Germany. And so he issued a blockade. He shut down all the major roads and railroads that went into Berlin, because remember, Berlin was in the Russian sector. And in response, we flew old bombers, we and the British, and brought in coal and food and clothing, even candy for children. And this was all televised and put, or at least put over the radio. It was publicized for the world to hear. And it made Stalin look like a tyrant, and it made us look great, right? It was a big geopolitical win as far as public global opinion. And Truman was behind that, right? And he took a stand with the Korean War. Kim Il-sung, right? It was decided in the UN that Kim Il-sung, that the 38th parallel would be a permanent border between a separate North Korea and South Korea. And Kim Il-sung decided to violate international law and invade South Korea and forcefully make it communist. And we also know he had met with Stalin, and Stalin had given his blessing to this. And so Truman felt like, here we go. I issued the Truman Doctrine. Now the bullies are testing me in North Korea and Russia. And I have to show them that when I draw a line in the sand and they step over it, that my consequences are going to be real, that it's not empty bravado. So we, along with 16 nations from the UN, brought forces into South Korea and helped fight the war to a 3-year war to a stalemate. And it was dramatic. It was a ping pong war of going back and forth. They pushed us into the Pusan perimeter. They fought at a famous schoolyard and areas right on the edge of the peninsula. And then we fought and held our ground. And then we had the famous Incheon invasion, Inchon, went behind them or above them, the North Korean forces, and encircled them and began pushing them back. But we didn't stop at the 38th parallel and simply fighting a defensive war. We took the controversial position of chasing them all the way up to the Chinese border at the top of North Korea above Pyongyang. So we went all the way up to the Yalu River, and we were surprised to find a 1 million-man army of the Chinese that crossed the Yalu and fought against us. And we lost a lot of men in the Chosin Reservoir there in North Korea, and we began losing again. And then we fought back up to the 38th parallel, and that time we stopped, and it ended in a stalemate. But as far as global opinion, as far as the approval of the UN and international law, we were on the right side of the law. And Truman had stood up to the bully, and in the end had prevailed. And that not in that we technically won the Korean War, but we secured the pre-war boundary of the 38th parallel and kept South Korea independent, as he had promised he would do in the Truman Doctrine, right? For any country that was threatened by the armed imposition of communism. And so you have that as well. And so that's where I go in this handout with on the number of that praises Harry Truman, right? Then I take a 180 and say, okay, well, some people say that Truman may have provoked Stalin just as much as he may have deterred him, right? With his very confrontational tactics and confrontational attitude and philosophy in this Cold War, right? So you see evidence like of us meddling with our CIA. Our CIA, you're going to see it really escalate in the 1950s. But already in the 40s, our CIA is going to get involved in other countries and try to engage in sabotage, propaganda to try to undermine popularity of communist regimes, and even arm an insurgency to rise up against them. We tried it in North Korea. We tried it in China. We tried it in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland. We put a lot of arms and tried to arm a lot of people there. We tried to drive a wedge or encourage the wedge between the Czech Republic as well as Yugoslavia with the Soviet Union, both for different reasons, had their own kind of friction with Soviet Russia as members of the Warsaw Pact, and Yugoslavia is not going to be a member actually under Tito. So at any rate, we're going to, you might make the argument, instigate stuff, play the role of saboteur and troublemaker around the world through our CIA. You see in the video what we did in the Italian elections. Italy was way too far to the west in Europe for us to tolerate the popular election of communists. And that's interesting, right? Is because in his Truman Doctrine, there's a grand assumption, I'm sure more than one, but one is that he felt nowhere would any peaceful majority of people actually choose on their own volition without being threatened by force, would actually choose communism, right? And we're going to be humbled by that assumption, arguably in Vietnam. And we could have been humbled by it in Italy as well. The Communist Party, free of any military and civil war or anything like that, or arming of their political party, the Communist Party in Italy was very popular, and it scared the heck out of our CIA. So we got lots of Italian Americans to write home to their fellow Italian loved ones, imploring them not to vote for the Communist Party politicians. We made a deal with the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and the Vatican really was instrumental in turning things around. And pretty much with the priests, right, in their sermons during Mass, is in their homilies they would tell their parishioners, and of course 90% of Italians were Catholic, tell them you have to choose between Jesus and your faith or communism, because communism, right, from the time of Marx and with the Soviet Union included, and also Mao Zedong, they took the Marxian view that religion is like a Vicodin pill, is the opiate of the masses, to lull the poor to sleep and to get them to kind of passively accept their exploitation and their subjugated status, waiting for heaven. And so they were very, in many ways, communist regimes have been anti-religion and even persecuted Christian churches, etc. And so they really played on that, the CIA and the Catholic hierarchy. And it ended up turning the elections around against the communists, that we were heavily involved in manipulating that decision, right? And we did some bizarre things too. I mean, look up Operation Artichoke. We tried to employ agents into communist countries. And we, in the early years, we discovered that a lot of them were double agents working secretly against us and informing the enemy. And so we tried LSD and different drugs to try to manipulate them psychologically to tell us the truth. And it's crazy. Our CIA has done some crazy and bizarre things, including like in the Panama Canal Zone, like an early Guantanamo Bay, torturing people suspected of being double agents, etc., and trying to extract confessions from them by way of torture. And so we're also, it won't take long, and we're going to actually we're going to violently overthrow foreign heads of state of other countries for being communist. And so we'll get to that soon. So at any rate, the term I use in the revisionist history of Harry Truman is Manichaean. And Manichaean is usually used in a modern context with a negative connotation. It's that you see things that in reality are very shady gray, that are very complex with hundreds of different layers, and you simplistically divide them into two categories, which is not in line with the reality of things. And that Truman may have been a bit of a Manichaean as a president, whereby if you wanted, equal allocation of property, but yet you wanted nothing to do with the Soviet Union and you just wanted social and economic justice for your people, that it didn't matter. He simplistically labeled you as an evil communist, and you had to be, in some cases, even violently or surreptitiously opposed. And so to some, right, him being so Manichaean, seeing things as just good versus evil, may have exacerbated or made things worse as far as Cold War tensions. So for instance, again, when he united Western Germany with England and France, and Western Berlin with England and France, and we formed our own currency system, etc. That got Stalin to engage in the Berlin blockade, right? It provoked him, actually, because he felt like we were all against him. And we had a London conference on the future of Berlin and its election, and we didn't invite any of the Russians there. And then when we'd have these regular meetings in Berlin with the Russian authorities, they called us on it and said, what was discussed in your London conference? What are your plans for Western Berlin? And we refused to tell them anything about it. And they walked out of the meeting frustrated, because you already have depictions of Stalin as a paranoid man, and we're acting like these cliquey high school kids with England and France, leaving Russia out of all of our plans and all of our policies, right? And so in some cases, maybe, arguably, Harry Truman may have provoked Stalin into these things. Harry Truman established NATO, a contingency military alliance, just in case we went to war with the Soviet Union. We're making allies already, right? The Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, we gave $13.5 billion to any European countries that would accept it. But you look at the CNN video, there's good evidence that this was manipulative, at least partially manipulative, and not just altruistic, not just humanitarian, and trying to help Europe get out of its economic crisis at the end of World War II, but that there were strings attached to this, and we were trying to keep these European countries from turning communist, and kind of like buying them as our allies. And how we paid them varied from country to country, as far as what their economy was largely based on, etc. Like you see in the video, we literally gave mules to the Greeks. We gave car assembly machinery to the French, etc., and the Italians, etc. So at any rate, does anybody have any questions?
No questions.
Okay. So do you guys feel okay as far as, like, if you haven't, even if you haven't yet looked at this assignment, you feel like you have a pretty solid, like, introductory knowledge to it as you go into it? Okay, good.
I'm just wondering, are we allowed to use this information for our essay?
Of course. Now, on essay, are you referring to what I'm going to offer as extra credit, or what do you mean essay?
I'm referring to the assignment we have to turn on Sunday. I'm sorry. I'm just used to call it an essay.
No, it's okay. It's okay. No, I absolutely want you to use this information in your analysis and evaluation of an argumentative section in this assignment, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, hon. All right, no, absolutely. I'm intending to give you guys kind of a head start and share with you what I was intending to convey in each of these sections. Okay. All right. So after this week, we're going to do the, gosh, I believe next we're already at the civil rights movement. And then after the civil rights movement, we'll have another Cold War assignment, and we're almost done. It's crazy how quickly the semester is flying by.
Yeah, it's really crazy.
So be sure, okay, that to remember that if you have any assignments that you've not turned in, if you turn it in late, yes, I'll take 10 to 15 points off, but that's 35 to 40 points that you would have that you would not have if you have a 0. So something is certainly better than nothing, okay? And Leah, I promise I'm going to jump. My next thing is jumping onto the grades, okay, for you guys. I'll get on to that, okay? I apologize. I'm gonna play catch up soon.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Not to pressure or anything. I was just wondering if we could do something for extra credits so our grade can go up.
Yes, yes. I'm going to post that very soon. I have argumentative essays, argumentative write-ups, a list of them, and I'm going to offer you the choice of just choosing any one of them. And I'll write my general, expectations on the handout itself, and expect that by the beginning of next week.
Okay, perfect. I was also wondering what percentage did we need in this class to have an A?
Oh, I mean, I just go by the standard, hon. Just 90%, 90% of the total possible points or above. And so I'd have to look at it. I'll be happy to give you guys an announcement, but you should be able to find it on the syllabus. But just when I add up all these assignments and the 3 tests and the textbook quizzes, when I add that up, just 90% of those possible points. And remember also that if you are in limbo between 2 grades and you have shown effort in regularly turning in your assignments, etc., I reserve the right to bump your grade up as well.
Oh, okay, that's really good.
Okay, so absolutely. And also what I'm intending to put on here very soon, probably by the end of today, is I probably will give you a quiz this week on the early Cold War. So be looking for that, okay? I'll send it via an announcement, and I'll put it like usual under quizzes.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I really appreciate, girls, I really appreciate you you attending. You'll get extra credit. I'll add it to your Cold War score on this assignment for being here today. I really appreciate that. And if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go, okay?
Okay, thank you very much for the lecture. It was really helpful.
Good. I hope so, hon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I really appreciate both of you. Have a good day, okay? Hang
Thank
in
you.
there.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.